Picture this: you are running for your life, not from a beast of the wild, but from the cold, calculated cruelty of men who wear badges and smile while they sign away your future. Rain, sharp as needles, drives down from a bruised and starless sky, turning the dirt path into a treacherous river of mud that sucks at your boots with every desperate step. Your lungs are twin fires, your heart a frantic drum against your ribs. Behind you, you can hear the distant, guttural shouts of your pursuers, their lanterns bobbing like malevolent will-o'-the-wisps in the oppressive dark. You have begged for aid in the town, pleaded your case in the dusty office of the law, and cried out your truth in the courthouse square. But every door was closed to you, every face turned away. Their silence was a verdict, a condemnation. Now there is only one last, desperate hope. A flicker of light in the distance, high on the ridge where the wilderness begins. The home of a drifter, a recluse the townspeople speak of in hushed, wary tones. A man with a past they say is best left undisturbed. You reach his cabin, your knuckles raw as you pound on the solid oak door. It feels like you are beating against the heart of the mountain itself. You scream for help, your voice swallowed by the storm's roar. This is your last chance. Will this door, the very last one, also remain shut? The heavy door creaked open, not with a welcoming swing, but with a slow, grudging reluctance, as if fighting its own hinges. In the sliver of space stood a man who seemed carved from the very rock of the mountain he inhabited. He was tall and broad-shouldered, the flickering lamplight from within casting deep shadows across a face that had seen too much hardship. A jagged scar, a pale lightning strike against weathered skin, ran from his left ear to the corner of his mouth, pulling it into a permanent, grim line. His eyes, the color of slate under a winter sky, held no pity, only a deep, weary stillness. He was Silas, the drifter. He looked down at the desperate, mud-splattered woman on his doorstep, her name Alara, and his gaze was impassive. She had tried to tell them all in the town of Redemption Creek. She had shown them the deed to her family's farm, the paper her father had pressed into her hand on his deathbed. But Mayor Thorne, a man whose smile never reached his cold, avaricious eyes, had produced his own document, a ledger of debts she knew to be forged, and declared her land forfeit and her person his indentured property until the fabricated sum was paid. He owned the sheriff, the judge, and the fear of the townsfolk. When she refused, he had sent his men. "Please," Alara gasped, the word torn from her throat. "They're coming for me. The mayor, She didn't need to finish. In a town as small as Redemption Creek, secrets were a currency, and Thorne's corruption was the coin of the realm. Silas said nothing. His eyes scanned the treeline behind her, catching the faint, dancing lights of the pursuit. For a long moment, he simply stood there, a bulwark against the storm, and Alara's heart sank. He was going to close the door. He was just like all the others. But then, with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of 100 storms just like this one, he stepped back. "Get inside," he rumbled, his voice low and gravelly, like stones tumbling in a deep riverbed. He didn't offer comfort or ask questions. He simply opened the door wider, a silent, profound act of defiance against the world that had cast her out. She stumbled past him into the Spartan warmth of the one-room cabin. A fire crackled in the stone hearth. The air smelled of pine wood and hot metal. Tools of a blacksmith's trade hung neatly on one wall. As Silas bolted the heavy door, the sound of the storm and the shouts of her pursuers were muted, becoming a distant, impotent rage. In the sudden, ringing silence of the cabin, Alara looked at the stoic, scarred man who had offered her sanctuary, and for the first time in weeks, a fragile seed of hope, terrifying in its vulnerability, began to take root in the barren desert of her soul. He had listened when no one else would. The days that followed bled into one another, marked not by a calendar but by the rising and setting of the sun over the jagged peaks. A quiet, unspoken rhythm established itself within the small cabin. Alara, accustomed to the tireless work of a farm, could not sit idle. She found a patch of earth behind the cabin and, using a sharpened spade she found in his shed, began to coax life from the soil, planting the few hardy vegetable seeds she had managed to grab in her flight. She mended Silas's worn shirts with a needle and thread she discovered in a small wooden box, her stitches neat and even. She learned the landscape of his silence, a vast and complex territory. She saw how his hands, calloused and strong from the forge, could also be gentle as he reset the wing of a fallen sparrow he found near the woodpile. Silas, in turn, worked his forge. The rhythmic, echoing clang of his hammer on hot steel became the steady heartbeat of their shared solitude. He was a master of his craft, shaping raw, unyielding iron into tools of purpose and strength. Horseshoes, hinges, plowshares. He spoke little, his words as carefully rationed as water in a drought. But he watched her. He saw the tremor that still ran through her hands when a shadow passed the window too quickly. He saw the way her eyes stared sightless at the burning embers in the hearth at night, lost in a past that was still too close. One evening, as she was banking the fire, her hand brushed against a small, crudely carved wooden horse on the mantelpiece. It was worn smooth with time, its features softened by countless touches. "My daughters," Silas said. His voice so quiet it was almost part of the fire's crackle. Alara froze, her hand hovering over the toy. He had never spoken of a family. "Her name was Lily," he continued, his gaze fixed on the flames, his stoic mask cracking just enough to reveal the raw grief beneath. "And my wife, Sarah. We had a small holding down in the southern valley. A land baron came, much like your Mayor Thorne. He had papers, too. Said the land was his. I fought him, in the courts and then with my fists. They called me a vigilante, an outlaw." He paused, and a muscle feathered in his jaw. The scar on his face seemed to deepen in the firelight. "I was away, trying to find a lawyer in a bigger city who would listen. When I returned, there was just smoke. The Baron's men had come. There was nothing left. The silence that followed was heavy with the ghosts of a life he had lost." Alara finally understood. His silence was not born of indifference, but of a pain so profound it had stolen his words. He was not just a drifter. He was a man in exile from his own life, a man who had failed to protect his family and had been running from that failure ever since. In her plight, he saw the horrifying echo of his own past. By saving her, he was desperately trying to rewrite the ending of his own tragic story. Alara reached out, her fingers gently closing over his large, scarred hand. It was a simple, profound gesture of understanding. She was no longer just a refugee in his home, and he was no longer just her protector. They were two broken souls who had, against all odds, found a fragile peace in the quiet wilderness, their shared wounds beginning to knit together in the sanctuary of the mountain cabin. The fragile peace was not destined to last. Mayor Thorne was a man who did not tolerate loose ends, and Alara was a loose end that frayed his sense of total control. Word travels fast, even to the highest ridges, and it wasn't long before whispers of the woman living with the scarred recluse reached the mayor's ears. His lips, perpetually curved in a condescending smirk, thinned into a line of pure malice. He saw her not as a person, but as a challenge to his authority, a piece of property that had dared to run away. He would make an example of her, and of the drifter who had dared to harbor her. One bright, cloudless afternoon, when the air was still and the only sound was the buzz of insects in the new garden, the peace was shattered. The rhythmic clang of Silas's hammer stopped abruptly. He stood dead still, his head cocked, listening. Alara, pulling weeds between rows of thriving green shoots, heard it too, the unmistakable sound of shod horses climbing the mountain path. Not one rider, but several. Her blood ran cold. She looked to Silas, her eyes wide with terror. His face was a mask of grim resolve. "Go inside," he commanded, his voice devoid of warmth, all business. "Bolt the door. Do not open it." He turned not to the cabin, but to his forge, his movements deliberate and calm. He stoked the coals until they glowed a malevolent orange, the heat shimmering in the air. Mayor Thorne and 3 of his deputized thugs rode into the clearing. Thorne dismounted with an arrogant flourish, his expensive suit and polished boots a-stark, obscene contrast to the rugged wilderness. He surveyed the small, tidy cabin and the garden with a sneer. "Well, well," he called out, his voice dripping with false joviality. "It seems our runaway has found herself a little nest. I've come to collect my property." Drifter Silas emerged from the shadows of his workshop, wiping his hands on a leather apron. He held a heavy blacksmith's hammer in one hand, its weight resting comfortably, naturally, in his grip. He did not look at the deputies. His slate-gray eyes were locked on Thorn. "She is not your property," Silas stated, each word a solid, immovable stone. Thorn chuckled, a nasty, grating sound. "Oh, but she is. I have the legal documents right here." He patted a leather satchel at his side. "Sealed by a judge. She owes a debt. Her father's foolishness is now her burden. You are obstructing justice, and I could have you arrested for it. But I am a reasonable man. Just give her to us, and you can return to whatever it is you do in this miserable sty." Elara watched through a crack in the door, her heart pounding a frantic, suffocating rhythm. This was it, the confrontation she had been dreading. Thorn gestured to his men. "Go on. Get her." As the two deputies started toward the cabin, Silas moved. He was not a flashy fighter. There was no artistry to his motion, only a brutal, terrifying efficiency born of a life of hard labor and buried rage. He swung the hammer not as a weapon, but as an extension of his arm, a tool he knew intimately. The first deputy's pistol was sent flying as the hammer connected with his wrist in a sickening crunch of bone. The second man hesitated, pulling his own weapon, but Silas was already on him, using the momentum of his first swing to ram his shoulder into the man's chest, sending him sprawling into the dirt. It was over in seconds. The deputies were groaning on the ground, disarmed and disabled. The third, standing by the horses, watched in stunned disbelief, his hand hovering over his gun but making no move to draw it. Thorn's smirk had vanished, replaced by a mask of pure fury. He reached into his coat, his eyes glinting with murderous intent. "You will regret that, Drifter," he spat, his hand closing around the butt of a hidden pistol. The final standoff had arrived. Just as Thorn's hand began to draw the pistol from his coat, a new sound cut through the tense air, the crunch of footsteps and worried voices from the path below. From the treeline emerged a small group of townspeople. There was the baker, his hands still dusted with flour, the stable master, and a few farmers whose lands bordered Thorn's acquisitions. They were the ones who had closed their doors to Elara, the ones who had listened to Thorn's lies and bowed their heads in fear. But Silas's solitary defiance had been a stone thrown into the stagnant pond of their conscience, and the ripples had finally reached them. Seeing Thorn and his men ride out for the mountain, armed and furious, had stirred something in them, a deep, buried shame that was finally stronger than their fear. They had followed, not knowing what they would do, only knowing they could no longer do nothing. Their arrival shattered the dynamic of the confrontation. Thorn's power was absolute only when it was unopposed. He thrived on the illusion of universal consent born of intimidation. Now, faced with the collective, questioning gaze of the very people he ruled, his authority began to crumble. He looked from Silas's unyielding form to the faces of the townspeople, and he saw not fear, but judgment. The third deputy, seeing the shift in power, slowly took his hand away from his pistol and took a half-step back towards his horse. The spell was broken. "This isn't over," Thorn snarled, the threat sounding hollow and pathetic. He holstered his unseen pistol, his face a contorted mask of hatred. He glared at Elara, who now stood in the open cabin doorway, and then at Silas, who hadn't moved a muscle. With as much dignity as he could muster, which wasn't much, Thorn collected his injured, groaning men and retreated back down the mountain path, leaving a trail of broken power and empty promises of revenge. A profound silence descended upon the clearing, broken only by the chirping of a bird in a nearby pine. The baker was the first to speak, his voice thick with emotion as he looked at Elara. We are sorry," he stammered, twisting his hat in his hands. "We were afraid. He has so much power. We should have listened, Ilara simply nodded. The relief so overwhelming it left no room for anger. She looked at Silas, her protector, the man who had faced down her demons when the entire world had looked away. His stoic expression remained, but she saw a flicker of something new in his slate-gray eyes. Not the weary stillness of old grief, but the quiet, profound peace of redemption. The barrier of solitude around the cabin had been broken, not by an enemy, but by a community, however hesitant, seeking to heal itself. In the days that followed, the townspeople would bring offerings, a sack of flour, a jar of preserves, a promise of legal help from a cousin in the capital. A new family was being forged in the mountain air, one born not of blood, but of shared courage and a collective stand against the darkness. Standing beside Silas on the ridge, looking down at the valley below, Ilara knew she was finally home. What is it that allows one person to find their courage when an entire community has lost its own? How many times do we turn away, telling ourselves it is not our fight, not our problem? The story of Ilara and Silas is not just a tale from a bygone era. It is a mirror. It asks us to look at the moments in our own lives where we had the choice to be a closed door or an open sanctuary. It reminds us that the foundation of any true community is not built on silent consent to injustice, but on the brave, often lonely voices that dare to speak the truth. The world is full of mayors like Thorn, men who wield fear as a weapon and count on our indifference. But it is also full of people like Silas, individuals who, despite their own scars and their own pain, choose to stand up and say, "No more." They remind us that the most powerful weapon against tyranny is not a hammer or a gun, but a single act of unwavering compassion. If this story of courage and redemption has moved you, if it has made you think about the silent choices we make every day, let us know in the comments below. Your voice matters. And for more stories that explore the strength of the human spirit, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Thank you for listening.